I've got a first-time guest who says we should fix the tax system so that most of us wouldn't have to file tax returns. How would that work? Does that even make sense? Let's find out, starting right now.
This is Debt Free in 30. Here's your host, Doug Hoyes.
I see it all the time. It's hard to find a full-time job as an employee, so people become self-employed. It's very common in construction and in IT and for hairdressers. With lots of jobs, you're self-employed, meaning you're responsible for collecting and paying your own taxes. And that's complicated. And if you can't afford a good accountant, you get behind on filing your taxes, and then Canada Revenue Agency gets mad and freezes your bank account, and now you got a big problem. In Canada, we have two problems. Some would say our taxes are high, and everyone would say our taxes are too complicated. We won't get into high taxes today. That's a complicated issue. But is it possible to make our tax system simpler? Well, my guest today says yes, it is. So let's get started. Who are you and what do you do?
My name is Neal Winokur. I'm an accountant, and I've been an accountant now for 10 long years. I started my own practice about 7 years ago. And over the past 7 years, I've come to realize and really understand how complicated our tax system is. And that really frustrated me. So I wrote a book about it called The Grumpy Accountant. And in this book, I try to show how we can simplify the tax system.
And I will put a link up to The Grumpy Accountant on the show notes in YouTube, but it's pretty easy to find if you go to Amazon and type in The Grumpy Accountant, and the book, paperback, Kindle, whatever shows up there. So Neal, thank you very much for being here. So let's start with the premise that you're saying the tax system is too complicated. And as I said at the beginning, for my clients, yes, it is complicated. I meet with, it's got to be a few people every single week who say to me, oh yeah, I haven't done my taxes for 4 years. And I got all these other debts as well. And I go, why haven't you done them? And they go, well, I don't know how to do it. I'm a laborer. I'm an IT guy. I'm in construction. I'm not an accountant. I don't know how to do it. And I'm sitting there, of course, because you and I are both chartered accountants. We're both CPAs. So we sit there going, well, it's not that hard. You take your T4 and you type it in the computer. But if you've worked 3 or 4 different jobs and you've only got 2 of your T4s, not all 4 of them, and if you're self-employed and you got all these receipts and all the rest of it, it's like, and I don't have the tax program on my computer, and I don't know how I'm supposed to do it. And so it's like, you know what, I'm just not going to do it. And the next thing you know, 2 or 3 years have gone by, and now you got all these taxes you haven't filed. I actually had a guy a few weeks ago who hadn't done his taxes for 5 or 6 years. So I said, okay, well, you got to get them done. So I gave him some advice on how to do that, put him in touch with someone to help him out. Well, it turned out he actually got a refund. He didn't owe money. He thought he owed like $20,000. Well, no, he actually got a refund back. So that's certainly a barrier. So that's how I see the tax system being complicated. And maybe it's more of a perception thing than anyone else. Tell me from your point of view, why you think the tax system is complicated. Tell me about how many people we have to hire to prepare taxes. Tell me about how many people work for CRA. Like, give me some proof that your contention is correct, that the tax system really is complicated.
Okay, so first of all, for some people, if they're an employee and they have a T4 slip and they don't have much else, for them, maybe it's not so complicated. But for most people, once they get married and they start having children, or especially anyone who is self-employed and starts up their own business, there is so much involved in filing your tax returns because of all these tax deductions and tax credits. So a lot of people, they have trouble understanding what deductions, what credits am I entitled to? And that's what forces them to go and hire people like me, or maybe they go to H&R Block or Liberty Tax, and they have to figure out, well, nobody wants to leave money on the table at tax time. But there's so many deductions and credits that have become riddled into our tax system over the years that nobody knows what they're entitled to. And the deductions and credits are constantly changing. So the complexity involved is that if you want to claim a deduction or credit, first of all, you have to know what to claim. You have to know if you're eligible. You have to keep receipts on file for over 6 years. And you usually have to spend money to file your tax returns. So it's estimated that the average Canadian household, on average, is spending about $500 a year to file their tax returns. And that's a total of $7 billion a year that Canadian households spend. That doesn't even include corporations and businesses. And the budget for the CRA is now approaching, it's almost $5 billion every year. And that was not the case, 10 years ago. That's doubled over the past number of years. So, and there's 40,000 people who now work at the CRA. And if we compare that to our neighbors to the south in the US, the IRS has about 80,000 employees. So the US has 10 times the population of Canada, but only 2 times the number of people working at their tax administration authority. Now, it's not exactly a fair comparison because each state, administers their own income tax separate from the IRS, but it still shows you that something here is out of, it's out of whack. There's something wrong here. And one of my favorite statistics is that the CRA receives 53 million phone calls a year from Canadians, which is just, it's outrageous that we've allowed the system to become so complicated that people are calling the CRA constantly calling for all sorts of different reasons, but it's too much volume that they're dealing with. So I think it's definitely way too complicated. The fact that most people in Canada cannot file their own tax returns, that should be the biggest indicator. If people have to hire a tax filing professional, then we know the system is too complicated, because we don't do that with any other bill. If someone receives their car insurance premium renewal, or they receive their phone bill or their internet bill or their energy bill, you don't have to go and hire some sort of bill filing professional to calculate how much you really owe, or if you're going to get a refund. You don't have to keep receipts for 6 years. You don't have to worry about reassessments and objections and appeals and court cases. I mean, it's insane what we've allowed to take place here. And we don't do this with any other bill that we have. But everyone sort of just accepts it with our tax system, and we don't really question it. But I really started to question it as I really began to see how it really works.
So, okay, let me push back on one point then. And I would say, yeah, okay, the tax system is complicated because there's all those reasons you mentioned, but it's not like 1950 where we're all taking out a piece of paper and writing it down on a piece of paper. We use computers now. So it doesn't matter how many different, marginal tax rates there are. It doesn't matter how complicated the calculation is. I go to the computer. CRA now has an autofill feature. So long as I'm registered with CRA, I can open up my tax program. I can hit autofill. It sucks everything in. And the computer says, oh, I see that you're married. I see that you've got kids. I see that you've got this. I see that you got that. Do you have any receipts? Put them in. Like, is it really that complicated, or is this more of a mental barrier that we have thinking it's too complicated?
So the autofill system, it's definitely a step in the right direction. And as much as I like to criticize our tax system, I mean, that's what the whole book is about. The CRA is actually trying to make things easier for people with the use of technology. So accountants and tax preparers use Represent a Client. And of course, taxpayers themselves can use My Account, and for business owners, My Business Account. And it definitely makes things a lot easier. Autofill makes things a lot simpler, but autofill only helps for the slips that CRA has on file. So your T4 slips, T4As, T5s, T3s, people who receive CPP and old age security, those slips are all there, but they have no information about any deductions or credits that you're eligible to claim. If you have donation receipts, medical expenses, even the RRSP contribution receipts sometimes don't show up there. So there's still a lot that isn't in autofill. It only helps on the income side. It doesn't help if you're self-employed. And it doesn't really help. I mean, if you're married and you have children, it still doesn't help in terms of, well, which spouse should claim medical expenses? Which spouse should claim the donation receipts? Should we do spousal RRSP contributions? It's a step in the right direction, but it doesn't really help with the complexity, because it's all the deductions and credits. That's really my pet peeve with the system, and autofill does not address that.
Yeah, and you're right. The autofill I mean, one of the problems with it is you have to be registered with CRA, which you'd think is a simple matter, but it's not, because you got to go online and fill it out, and then it's got to send you the security code. And then, of course, here in 2020 with the pandemic and everything, if the things shut down, you don't get your mail and you don't get your code, and then you didn't get your code and the code expires. And so there's issues with that. Yeah. But you did kind of hit on the key point. Autofill is great for CRA because it makes sure that all of your income is there, which of course maximizes the tax revenue for them. It does not guarantee, in fact, it doesn't do anything with respect to the vast majority of deductions, a whole bunch of which you just reiterated there. So it's kind of more slanted in favor of CRA than the taxpayer. Okay, so let's accept the premise that the tax system is complicated. And let's accept the premise that that's a problem. It costs us a lot of money to prepare taxes and so on. What then is the solution that you are proposing? How can we simplify the personal tax system in Canada?
So the solution sounds very radical, but it's only radical because we're so used to the complexity we have right now. So my ideal solution would be we abolish and eliminate every single tax deduction and tax credit in the system. So the tax return, if you're an employee that receives a T4 slip and you have no other income, your T4 is the tax return. And there's no longer any obligation at the end of the year to file a tax return because your employer has already. Important point, because people sometimes forget, whenever an employee receives a T4 slip, the employer is giving you your copy and they're filing it to CRA also. So the CRA already has your T4. That's how autofill works, because they already have the slip. So if they already have the slip, why do we need to send it to them and pay money to download the software or hire an accountant? So to simplify the system, you have to abolish every deduction and credit, and then the T4 is the tax return. There's no such thing as a tax return anymore. That works for the majority of tax filers who are employees. Self-employed people would still have to file something, but I propose that it should be no more than a one-page tax return. And it would be so simple that they wouldn't need any help. They wouldn't have to hire an accountant. And I could go into more details of how it would look for self-employed people, because I have a lot to say about that. Because self-employed people right now have a huge, very burdensome compliance obligation. They basically have to become perfect bookkeepers or hire a perfect bookkeeper, and it's a huge burden on them. So I'd like to massively simplify the system for them as well. But at least for the majority of tax filers who are employees, the T4 becomes the tax return.
Okay, so let's think that through then. So let's assume that I'm an employee, and which I am. I'm an employee of a corporation called Hoyes Michaelis and Associates. I happen to be one of the owners of that corporation, but I am an employee. I do get a T4 slip every year. Mm-hmm. So at the end of the year, then I would, or I guess at the start of the following year, under your system, I would just do absolutely nothing. I think I would probably refine that by having everybody log into CRA and say, okay, here's your T4. Did we miss anything? We didn't. Okay, boom, click go, and you can submit your return, all in the background. One of the problems I see with that is, what happens if my situation has changed during the year? Now, maybe your answer is, well, it doesn't matter. We've eliminated all the deductions. So it doesn't matter if you're married or single, have kids, have medical expenses. But our tax system is set up now with a whole ton of deductions. Are you saying then everything gets eliminated and therefore it doesn't matter if your marital status changed or anything during the year? It wouldn't matter?
Pretty much it wouldn't matter. So, well, one of the proposals that I put forth in the book is that we should tax households instead of individuals. So your total tax bill should not be based on your individual income, but it should be based on your family income. And the way that would work is at the start of the year, when your employer has to calculate how much tax to deduct from your pay, you would tell your employer, well, I'm married, here's how much my spouse makes, here's our total family income. And what I've calculated is, if we eliminate and abolish every single deduction and credit, we could raise the basic exemption to about $50,000 per individual, or maybe 75 to 80,000 per household. So what that would mean is, so let's say every individual gets the first $50,000 of income exempt from tax. That covers 65% of income earners in the country. The bottom 65% of income earners in Canada earn $50,000 a year or less. So they would have zero income tax deducted from their pay. And at the end of the year, their T4 would be sent to CRA. They have no tax deducted from their pay. There's nothing to file. There's nothing to do. Now, for those who earn above $50,000 a year, the tax that would be deducted from their pay throughout the year would be the exact correct amount, because it's a flat amount above 50,000, and there would be no refunds or no further tax bill at the end of the year. So in theory, if you changed jobs during the year, you would just tell the new employer what your income year to date was, which we already do now. We already do that in the tax system right now. So yeah, it would be a very different way of doing things than we're doing right now. But I think the benefits would be so, I get so excited about it, because imagine if literally millions of Canadians would no longer have any obligation to file a tax return, to deal with the CRA, to worry about the delays in receiving the refunds and reassessments and CRA audits for every little deduction and credit. We could save money on the CRA end. So yeah, the mechanics of it would need like a big comprehensive, maybe 5 to 10 year study by the government to really hammer out the details. But I think we definitely need to do this.
So let's talk about one of the points you raised then, which is, okay, we're going to eliminate all the deductions, but it's not going to matter, because if you make less than 50 grand a year, you're not paying any taxes anyway. So you're not giving up anything. In fact, you're better off.
Right.
So are you advocating a flat tax system as part of this, or a continuation of the progressive tax system? And progressive tax meaning the more you make, the higher the percentage you pay. So obviously the percentage, if it's 50,000 or lower, would be zero.
Right.
Are you saying from 50,000 to $1 billion, it's the same percentage, or does the percentage go up as your income goes up?
I think what we should do is keep it as simple as possible. So you basically have 3 tax brackets. 0 to 50,000 of income, you pay 0. And then you have 1 tax bracket from, let's say, 50,000 to anywhere, let's say maybe 400,000 or 500,000 would be 1 flat rate. And then any income above 500,000, that would be the high bracket, and that would have a slightly higher rate. So you could still have a progressive tax system and still keep it very simple. My goal is simplicity, and I understand most Canadians want a progressive tax system, and most Canadians believe the more you make, the more you should pay. So if that's what people want, that's fine. But we could still keep it as simple as possible. I don't think we need more than the basic exemption, a middle tax bracket, and a high tax bracket. Right now, if you look up the tax brackets for 2020, let's say you're in Ontario, I mean, there's like 15 different brackets you go through. It's ridiculous. It's so unnecessary to have it that many brackets.
Yeah, and I would argue that the number of brackets doesn't really introduce much complexity to it, because the computer's figuring it out anyways. All the deductions and everything, that's a different story. Right. I had Jeff Rubin on the podcast, and he made the point that we really don't have a progressive tax system, because the rich people are getting the bulk of their income from capital gains and dividends, which of course are taxed at a lower rate than normal employment income.
Right.
So under your system, would capital gains and dividends be taxed the same as normal income, or is that really not really relevant for what we're talking about?
So in the book, I actually kind of leave that out to kind of keep things simpler, just, in terms of how I presented the book, because I wanted the book to appeal to masses of Canadians. So I kept it as simple as possible. But I've thought about this issue a lot. There's a really interesting example in the United States. The state of New Hampshire, on a state level, is one of the states with no income tax. So their state income tax is 0, but only on employment income. So if you are a laborer, a worker, a wage earner, employed or self-employed in New Hampshire, you pay zero tax on employment income, but they do tax investment income. And I think that's actually not a bad idea, because I don't like the idea of employees, workers who work so hard, paying crazy high amounts of tax rates on their labor. And then dividend income, capital gains, interest income is fully taxable, but dividends and capital gains has, the more favorable tax rates. And although, Canadians from all across the income spectrum do realize investment income, but you're right, the bulk of it does go to those higher brackets. And it benefits people maybe who maybe don't really need those tax breaks. So that's definitely something they should look at to make things. And there are other countries in Europe where actually investment income, like dividend income, is taxed at a flat rate, and the banks actually withhold tax from the dividends at a flat rate, and that keeps the tax return filing simpler. So there's definitely ways we could look at that and how that fits into the equation. Capital gains gets complicated because there's different types of capital gains out there, and I don't like the idea of taxing inflation. So sometimes the gain isn't really a gain. It's someone holding an asset for 20 years. Like, that's the whole thing. That's why we don't really tax principal residences. If you've lived in your house for 30 years, you sell it, you have this big gain. Well, is that really a gain, or is it just inflation? But if you have a short-term gain, you bought a stock, you sold it a month later, you have a nice big gain. Well, that's not inflation, that's real income. We should tax it. So in the US, they distinguish between a short-term capital gain and a long-term capital gain. And there's different tax rates for that, but that makes things more complicated, which I don't really like. So it's not an easy issue.
Yeah, and that kind of comes back to the central point. So why is it that we have such a complicated tax system? Well, because we're trying to do a whole bunch of stuff. So politicians like to have a bunch of different stuff so they can say, hey, look what I did. I just gave you this new deduction. I mean, we have the RRSP deduction, which of course encourages people to save for retirement. So, I mean, isn't that a good thing? Don't we want to be encouraging people to save for retirement? We've got a deduction for childcare. Well, okay, isn't it kind of fair that if you've got kids, you should get a bit more of a break than someone who doesn't have kids? Because obviously you've got additional expenses. We've got a medical expense deduction. So if I happen to have a serious medical issue, had to pay a lot in prescriptions and other stuff, should I get a bit of a break as compared to somebody who didn't go through that? We have a deduction for rent. It's certainly in Ontario here, where if I'm a renter, then there's a deduction I get to claim, whereas mortgage interest, generally speaking, isn't deductible in Canada. Obviously, it is in the US. So again, we're trying to level the playing field about a bit by giving deductions to people who need them. And even more importantly, what we're trying to do is give deductions so that the government can encourage a certain type of behavior. We want you to save for your retirement, so we're going to give you a deduction for that. By eliminating all those deductions, do you not then cause the problem of not allowing politicians to throw goodies at us? And as a result, while your idea is a very good idea in principle, in practice, it would never work because politicians would never want to do it. You're taking away all their power. Isn't that the real problem with tax reform?
Yeah, and that's exactly why we need to simplify the tax system. I want to take away their power. I want to depoliticize the tax system. I hate the fact that politicians use targeted tax deductions and credits to target their favorite group of voters at election time. And both major political parties have been guilty of this in the past. We see this all the time. And I actually had a very interesting conversation about this very issue with someone. I wrote an article a few years ago criticizing all of these credits and deductions. And I called the child fitness tax credit and the child arts tax credit, which used to exist in the Harper years, I called them silly. I said, these are silly tax credits. And someone actually called me up. I got a phone call from someone who said she was actually on the team that helped design those tax credits when they first came out. I said, wow, that's so cool. Thank you for calling me. And she said to me, I don't like that you call them silly tax credits. And she explained the rationale for the child fitness and arts credit. She said, we want to encourage parents to get their kids active, put their kids in fitness programs. And even though the tax credit, it's such a small amount, and even though it's complicated, people have to keep the receipts, and then the CRA audits the receipts, it gets parents thinking, oh, child fitness credit, I'm going to enroll my kids in soccer. So what I told her was, and this response that I'm about to give, this applies to every tax credit and deduction, which is well-intentioned. Just like you said, the medical expense credit helps people who have these unexpected medical bills. The RSP deduction is helping people save money. Every credit and deduction in the system has a valid, well-intentioned purpose and reason behind it, just like you said, which is to encourage certain behavior, help people when they need the help. But my point is, if politicians want to encourage certain behavior or they want to help people in certain ways, don't use the T1 individual tax return filing system, because it makes it so complicated. And that complexity actually hurts people, because if you can't afford a good accountant, then you're out of luck. You don't know what deductions and credits are available because they change every year. And every time there's a change in government, the deductions and credits change. So when the Trudeau Liberals took power, they eliminated the child fitness credit, the child arts credit, the public transit tax credit, the home renovation tax credit, and they put in their own tax credits. They put in tax credit for teachers who have school supplies that they're not reimbursed for. They added a climate action incentive. They added new tax credits and eliminated the old ones. And look, if there's an election coming up or and there's another change in government, we're going to have new tax credits and they're going to eliminate other ones. So what I don't like about these credits and deductions, even though they're well-intentioned, even though they help people at certain stages in life, it's micromanaging our lives. If the government wants to encourage people to save money for their retirement, just lower the income tax rate. And then people will understand that if they earn investment income, that will also be tax-free up to $50,000, like I said before. So we have to look at other ways of encouraging this behavior, the behavior that government wants to encourage, but not using these ridiculous credits and deductions in the tax filing system. Don't use the tax return system to try to accomplish your political goals. And my beef with it is that every new government that takes power, they recreate the tax system in their own image, based on their political party's values. And it's constantly changing. So I would like a complete depoliticization of the tax system. Even though, people will lose out on these credits and deductions, but the basic exemption would go up. So for most people, it would be neutral.
Yeah, and unfortunately, the problem is we can't have a depoliticized political system because that's just not how it works. I mean, the politicians got a politic, right? But if what you want is a totally radical solution, how about this? How about, let's take a page from New Hampshire's book and totally eliminate income tax altogether. Just totally eliminate it. So I took a look at last year's budget. So this is the projections for 2018, 2019. And obviously these projections and going forward, nobody knows what's going on because of the pandemic and all the numbers will be totally crazy. But the projection was that personal income tax receipts would be somewhere around $160 billion, which was about half of total government receipts. Right. Which means the other half was coming from things like the GST, HST, import duties, excise duties, fuel surcharges, and so on and so forth.
And corporate income tax.
And corporate income tax. Right. Corporate income tax was about $50 billion. Personal income tax was about $160. Now, to me, corporate income tax isn't really a thing because all corporations ultimately are owned by people. So it's all flowing through somehow. But regardless, okay, let's leave the corporations where it is. But could we not have a system where we just say, let's make it completely simple. There is no personal income tax and the government will, obviously they're going to save a bunch of money by not having to administer the tax system, but we could also raise whatever revenue is needed through HST, excise tax, tariffs. Maybe we start, thinking about an inheritance tax or a financial transactions tax or a more robust capital gains tax. That would be the most absolutely radical way to do it. Eliminate the income tax system altogether. What do you think of that idea?
Look, in theory, I love it. And I think it's something that should be looked at, honestly. Economists have been saying this for years. Income taxes should be replaced with consumption taxes like the GST, a sales tax. Now, actually, when GST first came into being in Canada, it was 1991, the Brian Mulroney government. The GST was actually extremely unpopular. There was like a rebellion. I was only 6 years old at the time, but I read about it. And the Jean Chrétien Liberals won in a landslide election in 1990, I think it was 92 or 93, promising to abolish the GST. And of course, they never did. But the intention of the Brian Mulroney government, when they brought in the GST, was actually to slowly replace the income tax with the sales tax. And a sales tax, in theory, is much simpler because you buy something, you pay the tax, and that's pretty much it. Now, what we've done with our GST system in Canada is we've also made a complete mess of it. There's so many exemptions and zero rated. And if you go to a bakery and you buy a package of 6 donuts, I think there's no GST on that. But if you buy 1 donut, there is GST. Or it might be the other way around. I don't remember. That's how complicated we've made the GST system. But in theory, eliminating income tax and replacing it with a consumptions tax, or maybe you raise the capital gains. I mean, yeah, it's definitely something we should look at. What I do in my book is try and just focus on simplicity versus complexity. That would be the ultimate simplicity. I just read another book that came out in April. It's called Making Life Less Taxing. It was written by another accountant named Kim Moody. He's out of Alberta. And in the second half of the book, he goes into his ideas about simplifying the tax system. And this is exactly what he proposes. He says, eliminate income tax entirely and raise the sales tax, this might sound crazy, to 33%, 25 or 33%. Now, people will criticize that and say, if you eliminate income tax and move to a sales tax, that hurts people with lower incomes. They say it's regressive, meaning it hurts lower income people more. But there's ways of getting around that. You exempt basic groceries, you exempt residential rent. So basic necessities of life, which we do right now with the GST. No one pays GST on basic groceries or their rent. And also, you give sales GST credits to people, which is what we do right now. The government right now, they collect about $35 billion of GST revenue every year, and they give back $5 billion to low-income Canadians as GST credits. So there are ways of fixing that. But yeah, in theory, I love the idea of just eliminating income tax entirely, replacing it with a sales tax. And obviously the other part of the equation is government needs to kind of shrink its role a little bit and save money on the expense side, but that's obviously a whole other conversation.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what the conclusion of this is. Yeah, there's a whole lot of things that could be done, but it's a very complicated issue because if you do this, well, that affects that, and so you gotta tweak everything. So maybe the answer is, yeah, we need a royal commission on taxation. Yes. Let's take a year or 2 or 3 and actually go through all the different options, game theory them out, and see what would be necessary. And I think another point that, may not be obvious to everybody, but the government doesn't really need our tax revenue. I mean, we've seen it in 2020 where it's not, the way it does not work is the government taxes and then they spend. It's the other way around. And so we've seen it here in 2020. I don't know what the federal deficit's going to end up being, 300 billion, 500 billion, I don't know. But whatever that number is, that is money they spent without having the tax revenue to back it up. So we can tweak things. Now, of course, we're probably going to be stuck with massive deficits going forward and debt and all the rest of it. But the two are not directly related. And you're right. There are some issues with mucking with the HST system because, people at the lower income brackets spend a whole much more percentage of their total income on consumption than the rich people who are putting money away in savings. So it may need to be a combination of many different types of taxes to raise the necessary revenue. But anyways, we could talk for a few more hours about this, but I think we've covered the key points. So tell everyone again, what is the name of your book? Where can people find it? And how can people track you down?
Sure. So the book is called The Grumpy Accountant. And it's true. I am grumpy in tax season. The rest of the year, I'm not as grumpy. But the title is true. The Grumpy Accountant. The paperback is on Amazon.ca. And the ebook and the audiobook are available everywhere. I actually narrated the audiobook. So if you want to listen to me rant for 5 hours on, you can buy the audiobook as well. I have a website, grumpyaccountant.ca. So that's how you could reach out to me. And grumpyaccountant.ca/blog is where I've written a lot of articles about these kinds of issues, and all of those are posted there as well.
Excellent. Well, that's a good one to bookmark. Neal, thanks very much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. That was great, and obviously lots to discuss. Again, the point of me doing these shows is to not say we should adopt this policy or that policy. What I'm trying to do, and that's why I'm basically was disagreeing with everything Neal said today. It wasn't because I necessarily disagreed with him. I want to get the conversation going. Let's think about what all the different options are. Let's come up with solutions that are better than what we've got today. That is our show for today. If you are so inclined, I would appreciate it if you'd leave a comment on our podcasting, on any podcasting app, however you listen to the show. And if you are listening or watching on YouTube, then please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Thanks for listening and watching. Until next week, I'm Doug Hoyes. That was Debt Free in 30.